The Ferrari power unit has been a major talking point over the course of the last week, but the questions about Ferrari's power unit have long been the subject of public and paddock interest for well over a year now. There have been questions raised dating back to the 2018 season, and while 2019 was full of moments that made people double take, it wasn't until the latest news cycle where the FIA seemingly planted themselves firmly between a rock and a hard place. In this video, I'll summarize the current state with the recent developments as well as share my opinions on the matter. But most important, I'll give you a comprehensive look at the full timeline. Much of the details around this situation have been deemed protected by the FIA, which certainly complicates things. This is at odds with their statement that they were not fully satisfied that Ferrari's power unit was perfectly in line with the technical regulations imposed for the 2019 season. Despite the FIA clearly taking some issue with the power unit to some degree, they have chosen to keep the details of the investigation quiet, the ultimate terms of their agreement with it. But throughout all of the statements, which we'll get to, I just want to make sure it's clear that the FIA chose not to overtly say that Ferrari broke the rules. That's really important to remember because you'll see a lot of people just dismissing that fact, because it is a fact. This prompted all of the teams on the grid without Ferrari power to coalesce against what appears to be the FIA covering up something. These teams include McLaren, Mercedes, Racing Point, Red Bull, Renault, AlphaTauri, and Williams. Their disagreement was formalized in an official letter that was sent out directly to the FIA. The FIA then responded one day later and has since, on Friday, come back with another response after they met in Geneva for the World Motorsport Council. But before we even get to those statements, how did we even get to this point? How did we get here? Frankly, I think that matters a great deal. If you want to just see the absolute documents in their terms, how they were put, down in the description, I'll have a link to the full-on article for this entire story. So, how did we get here? We have to jump in our time machine and go back to October 2018. Around the time of the Japanese Grand Prix, Arriva Bene confirmed that a second sensor was added to the Ferrari car, but both he and Charlie Whiting were quick to quiet any talks that this sensor had been a headwind to Ferrari's performance. And while this appeased many naysayers, it didn't appease everyone, and certainly not for very long. I attribute much of today's swirl originating back to this point. I also empathize with the rhetoric Arriva Bene was using about the seriousness to which Ferrari would be taking the next issues going forward. It was almost like Ferrari felt like they were owed a favor from the FIA for playing ball and allowing that second sensor to be put on, despite the fact that this was just merely speculation that had prompted them to do so. Because again, similar to what's going on today, a lot of this was brought on by paddock speculation. In 2018, the situation ultimately came that the FIA found no breach. But keep in mind, teams avoid official complaints at all costs as to not create any situation to which it appears one team is targeting another team, or a group of teams are targeting a team, which is why it was so surprising that the FIA actually confirmed and named publicly those who filed the complaint, which is typically sealed, as Lorenzo Sassi and James Allison were identified, two former Ferrari employees. So with the background set, we can now fast forward to Canada, 2019. Newfound suspicion. The comments coming out of Renault's Nick Chester lacked any major implications, but they did say what everyone else was thinking out loud. How is a team dominating straight line speed while running wings that don't appear to have any foul play? It wasn't immediately evident that Ferrari were employing any aero tricks like exhaust blown rear wings, but Chester clearly had some level of concern, or just maybe more fairly stated, interest in how Ferrari were achieving this. And this is one of the first times in the grand scheme of the whole timeline we start hearing in 2019 about Ferrari's power. But with the situation being so topical in 2018, it was only a matter of time really. It was Ferrari's lack of success on track that fueled so much of the uprising later, as it created a very stark contrast that really couldn't be ignored. 3-peat victories. Before the break, Ferrari had 0 wins and 3 poles. After the break, Ferrari had back-to-back victories, 2 going to Leclerc and 1 going to Vettel. More importantly, Ferrari wouldn't lose a pole position until the US Grand Prix, where they would fail to get another pole after that. It's not enough to measure those results alone though. Comparatively, the suspicions hold up. In 2018, with Sebastian and Kimi, the Scuderia won 2 Grand Prix, one at Spa, the other at the US Grand Prix, while taking their lone post-break pole at their home race. So it is true that in 2019, Ferrari are performing at tracks that are power hungry, which is in line with someone who has a straight line speed advantage. But it's not as if it would be fair to be confused how they managed to double their pole count to 6 in exactly half the amount of races compared to the front half of the season and right after the break. And it was here at the Belgian Grand Prix that Christian Horner revealed that Red Bull had indeed issued an informal request, asking the FIA to actually look into Ferrari's power after witnessing the leap they made at Spa. October 2019. Ferrari's dominant spell ensued after the break, and if they weren't winning races, they were inevitably on pole. This came to a screeching halt at the US Grand Prix. This plays a key important role in the narrative due to the fact that Ferrari's advantage seemingly dissipated the very race the technical directive was issued surrounding flow and highlighting how fuel flow tricks are not to be permitted. So let's actually get into the details of that technical directive, which turned out to be TD 3519. Despite the talk on the paddock and the FIA being engaged informally, no team had yet to launch an official complaint just yet. It came to light that Red Bull's chief engineer had sent an official inquiry into the FIA seeking clarification about fuel flow. And just to explain this in very simple terms, give me some rope. Fuel flow meters are fitted on each of the cars and are regulated by the FIA. The fuel flow meters measure in intervals. Therefore, if you were theoretically at a legal limitation as measured by the FIA at specific times of those measuring intervals, there could still be the possibility that at non-measurement intervals, your fuel flow exceeded those limits set by the FIA. Now, at the time, this was just a theory, but to further make the point, Red Bull went as far as to replicate the injection process on non-measured intervals using electrical currents to show that fuel flow sensors could be beaten. So on October 22nd, Red Bull cleverly drafted up 3 scenarios that could potentially cheat the fuel flow meters by the FIA, so that then the FIA could speak to those theoretical scenarios. This clearly was meant to set a precedent that would be used against any team that was deploying the tactic if the FIA clarified the scenarios would in fact be illegal. And just ahead of the US Grand Prix, Technical Directive 3519 was issued, where the FIA did in fact confirm that the scenarios outlined by Red Bull, as they were put, were illegal. I've also included a link in the description to the technical regulations for 2020 as outlined by the FIA if you've yet to download a copy or want one. So naturally, when the US Grand Prix arrived and Ferrari's straight line advantage had disappeared, the chatter intensified. This was only confirmed in the Grand Prix on Saturday as Ferrari had a very poor showing. And this also prompted one of 2019's most memorable moments as Verstappen, who was commenting on Ferrari's drop-off in performance after the FIA's clarification in TD 3519, said, "That's what happens when you stop cheating, of course." But it wasn't limited to just the notoriously non-filtered Dutchman. Even Lewis Hamilton chimed in after the poor performance by Ferrari after the FIA clarified. What's come out this week has been quite interesting to see. Obviously today, I think they've lost a bit of power. I'm interested to see how that continues and how it reflects on the race. But the FIA wasn't done. We had another directive coming, and that was TD 3819. A very important event in this whole saga was the fact that Ferrari fit major upgrades on the cars, which really shone bright in Singapore. This is a track where Red Bull is massively favored due to the circuit characteristics, but in 2019, Ferrari took pole and finished a comfortable 1-2. On top of the non-interval injections tampering with the fuel flow meters, the leading thought on the paddock was that Ferrari were using a controlled drip of oil to seep into the SF90's combustion process via the intercooler. If done in a targeted manner, it could deliver short power boosts and a pace advantage. Now with that said, there is no technical regulation against leveraging the intercooler. However, there is a clear rule against the improper use of cooling systems in a manner that would manipulate the combustion process. Refer to Article 7.5 of the 2020 Technical Regulations to see the stipulations there. Up until this point, we still have a technical directive, and it's really just all noise about the Ferrari power unit that could be chalked up to competitors trying to slow down their upgrades and progress. But much to Maranello's chagrin, the FIA issued this new technical directive, 3819, and this time the TD was aimed at what many were speculating about regarding the controlled drips in the Ferrari power unit. So now we have a technical directive issued, and then Ferrari all of a sudden start to lose pace. We have yet another technical directive which are directly in line with the speculation about Ferrari's power unit, and Ferrari continue to see a slowing of their pace. Somewhere between the Brazilian Grand Prix and Abu Dhabi, there are reports that the FIA seized parts of the Ferrari car, a Ferrari customer car, and a non-customer car. But I do want to add a major caveat to that. I don't see any reason to see that this isn't true, but I can only really find one source to this. What we know for sure is that the Ferrari investigation was officially opened by the FIA before the season finale in Abu Dhabi. As if the story couldn't get any more murky for Ferrari, they ran into even more negative headlines. Prior to the start of the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, Leclerc's car was chosen and checked as a part of a random selection process. It was found that his car had a discrepancy weight of 4.88 kilograms than he actually declared. Because this was a violation of a technical directive and not a technical regulation, Ferrari was fined €50,000 for its inaccurate declaration. The issue for many, including myself, was that the stewards made the decision to wait until after the Grand Prix to investigate, which allowed Leclerc to race. Ultimately, Leclerc does race and ends up on the podium in P3, and the season closes, but that's certainly not the last of the story. We flash forward to more recent events. 2020 testing. It's now February, and it's been a couple of months since we've even thought about the Ferrari power unit. But the FIA has been busy concluding an investigation stemming from the intrigue and inquiry from all of last season. We're in the last day of winter testing for the 2020 season. As the time ticks down into the final hour, as teams are wrapping up and staff are headed out, the FIA unleash mayhem. The first statement, the one that starts all of this, is on February 28th. They announced that their investigation into Ferrari's power unit was completed, but they decided ultimately not to make the findings public and keep the settlement private. Here are the exact words from what the FIA put in the first statement. Quote, "The FIA announces that after thorough technical investigations, it has concluded its analysis of the operation of the Scuderia Ferrari Formula One power unit and reached a settlement with the team. The specifics of the agreement will remain between the parties. The FIA and Scuderia Ferrari have agreed to a number of technical commitments that will improve the monitoring of all Formula One power units for the forthcoming championship seasons, as well as assist the FIA in other regulatory duties in Formula One and in its research activities on carbon emissions and sustainable fuels." Here's where I'm going to add in my opinion in a reaction to this first part of the letter. So choosing to release this at all says a lot. Now, naturally, this of course was always going to elicit a strong reaction from the other teams, but in no way does the FIA include any sort of consolation whatsoever to the other constructors. So what was the purpose of this? Now, this may have been the FIA recognizing they didn't have a choice. They had to release this. And maybe they thought it'd make Ferrari look bad, acting as some form of restitution to the matter. The second thing this could be is the settlement implies disagreement. In the least, Ferrari objected to what the FIA was proposing. If they had enough grounds to object in complete confidence with the investigative team, but reach a settlement, quote unquote, it's very likely the FIA could prove nothing beyond a reasonable doubt despite having full access to that car for months. The third thing I find really interesting about this is the use of the word commitments. This alludes to it benefiting all of Formula One. This goes on to kind of read and position Ferrari acting as the one teaching the FIA, as they'll be assisting with regulatory duties. This insinuates something Ferrari were doing caught the FIA by surprise, and they're not really sure what to do next. In order to improve their own systems, Ferrari could be acting as some form of a technical partner. And the fourth thing, which I've said once already, this is very important that there was no overt guilt references. At best, it reads as if Ferrari outsmarted the FIA. Team response on March 4th. Just as suspected, this did not go over well with the teams on the grid. The 7 teams without Ferrari power were quote-unquote surprised and shocked as they relayed their objections to a public dissent in early March. Again, the article linked in the description will actually have all of this written out, but like I said, I'll pop it up on screen so you can see it. And as I read this, my interpretation was this was about as clear a threat as you can possibly issue. But I guess what else did they expect? They offered no way to know whether this will continue. And in a sport of tens of millions of dollars on the line, these decisions are critical. The FIA did not take kindly to the not-so-veiled threat from the remaining teams. It took them just about a day to issue their own response to this initial response from the teams. But this opened up even more questions rather than resolve things. The FIA statement number 2, March 5th. Now, I'm also not going to read through all of this. I'll link to it. A lot of people covering this did not notice one very, very specific thing that the FIA did. They keep highlighting this phrase, "not fully satisfied," regarding the fact that the FIA was not fully satisfied. The PU was always in compliance with the regulations. Let's be clear about this. The FIA did not say that Ferrari were not in compliance. They said they were not fully satisfied, which begs the question, why didn't they take that extra step? If they didn't take it, you certainly cannot take it without evidence. And probably most important of all, this is when I started to stumble on the research about the word and the phrase material impossibility. That one stuck out at me as kind of weird because at first glance, how could it be impossible? But then when you look at it different, it kind of dawned on me. If you look at this like a lawyer wrote it, which surely a lawyer did write this, invoking very specific legal language to make it very clear, in my opinion, that this has to do with the protection of Ferrari's intellectual property, their development. And it's simply because that word impossibility seems so out of place that it really has to be a legal sense. The long-standing legal precedent for the word impossibility is usually defined as no possible way. So naturally, of course, I'm speculating, but the decision to use that word impossibility in conjunction with what's used next, which is to provide unequivocal evidence of a breach. They didn't say prove, they said to provide evidence. This has me thinking that this is so wrapped up and ingrained in the mission-critical intellectual property of Ferrari, on top of the fact that the FIA really couldn't distinguish if they were actually breaking the rules. All this rounds out a picture that starts to make a lot more sense to me. In the resulting summary statement that comes out of the World Motorsport Council meeting convened in Geneva, the FIA doubling down on their statement should have the 7 other teams worried about whether they're going to fold or whether they're bluffing, because it doesn't appear that they are. Here is the statement. The Council expressed unanimous support for the FIA President and the FIA Technical Department in regard to the overall management of the case, and strongly opposed any comments that undermine the reputation and image of the FIA in the Formula 1 World Championship. And that's where things left off. And really, the teams have a choice to make because they have to decide whether the FIA is bluffing and they're going to pursue this, because I don't know that they should or could. Even if they did pursue it, what's really going to come of this? If it does, in fact, turn out that the teams investigate, they push this, and they get some sort of unsealing of the documents, well, it's really just going to only include things that don't violate Ferrari's IP. And then the things that they are doing that are need-to-know basis, if they're not in violation of the Formula 1 documents and the technical regulations, they're just going to be in the exact same place the FIA are now. So net, were Ferrari cheating? I don't have any evidence to see that. The FIA doesn't even provide any sort of indication that they were cheating. Simply that it looks like it may have been out of bounds, but they can't even prove it themselves. So can we say they were cheating? Personally, I don't think we're there yet. I do think something was going on, but I don't think you can say they were cheating. And on the flip side, there's also some games going on with the other teams that obviously I don't appreciate. They can spare me their crocodile tears. We have people like Christian Horner, who was so vocal about all of this. Remember back to 2018, what he said after Spa, when Lewis was upset about Ferrari having all this pace in their power unit. What he said, quote, "Just to hear Lewis moaning about Ferrari, I nearly got my violin out." So all of a sudden, these things are now a giant problem. And I seem to remember when all of these teams, including Red Bull and Mercedes, of course, even lately, would have liked their IP to be protected. And in most cases, they are. So overall, do I like the fact that this is under seal? No. But if I make the assumption that this is about the mission-critical core part of Ferrari's intellectual property, do I have a problem with it? No, of course not. But the problem is the FIA is not saying that. There are 3 options going forward. The first, and most likely, let it go. And take the FIA at their word that more legal battles wouldn't necessarily yield a more favorable result. Option 2, reasonably likely, they could pursue a lengthy legal battle. The FIA has made it clear that they have no intention on backing down. With the season just around the corner, I don't see the grid wanting to get wrapped up in some mega battle just ahead of the stressful overhaul of this sports regulation in 2021. And option C, which is least likely, and I would say this is a long shot wild card, but it's possible the teams could make a stand. Melbourne is just a week away, and the 7 teams could refuse to race next to a team they don't feel is being governed by the regulatory body to the same extent. They could say that they are putting their car next to a team that they don't really believe is playing on a fair playing field. Now, this is a stretch and a highly, highly cynical play, but it did start to make me think. We're here in the first place because the teams think that the FIA are treating Ferrari different. So, wasn't it a likely outcome that this was going to happen? In my opinion, I see option A happening. I see them begrudgingly letting this go and focusing on 2021 because there are, of course, bigger fish to fry. Especially considering the FIA already announced that they're issuing the second fuel flow monitoring system in the cars in 2020, so they are looking out for this. So hopefully all of that made sense, and illuminating that timeline, hopefully that gave you a lot more insight into the nuances and you feel like you can make a better decision about all of this. But one thing is for sure, 2020 has already delivered on intrigue, and we're not even 1 Grand Prix into the season. Thanks for checking out this video and taking the time to watch it. I really appreciate your time. Leave your thoughts below. What do you think? Make sure to subscribe if you like Formula 1 news. Of course, I'll be making a lot more of it with the season about to start. I'll see you all very, very soon.